Lisbon, 1874, just as the sun broke over the Tagus River and the sails of the royal fleet snapped in the wind. The docks were already alive with shouting seamen and the sharp scent of fish, salt, and tar. Among them moved a tall young man with sun-browned skin and a linen shirt rolled to his elbows, hauling ropes with practiced ease. His name was Xandro Bell, and he was a fisherman's son from Almada, born to tides and storms, raised on the creaking planks of small boats that never strayed too far from shore. Today, he wasn't fishing. Not really. He was watching the pier just beyond the naval quarter where the royal barge had docked. A group of guards in gleaming brass helmets stood at attention, and among them, stepping down with the grace of someone used to being watched, was Princess Philomena Hartwell. She wore a high-collar traveling coat of deep navy, her dark hair pinned back beneath a modest hat, eyes hidden behind a thin lace veil. Her gloved fingers clutched a small book. She was not the sort of girl meant to be seen here, among the fishmongers and creaking hulls. But once a season, the royal family made a show of patronage visiting Lisbon's poorer quarters to remind the people they were not forgotten. Philomena didn't look like she was there to be seen. She looked like she was trying not to be noticed. Xandro watched from behind a stack of crates as she slipped away from her guards, just for a moment, ducking into a narrow alley behind the old fish auction house. He dropped the rope and followed. "Do you always follow noblewomen into alleys?" she asked without turning around. Xandro froze. "Only when they walk like they don't want to be found." She turned then. Her eyes were sharp, almost amused, though her mouth stayed serious. "And what are you, some spy disguised as a fisherman?" He grinned. "No. Just a fisherman disguised as a fool." She didn't laugh, but something in her shoulders relaxed. She looked over her shoulder, toward the waterfront. "They'll notice I've gone." "Then come with me," he said. "You're mad." "Probably." She hesitated but then she followed. Xandro led her through the winding backstreets of Alfama, where laundry fluttered from windows and old men played cards beneath cracked archways. They stopped in the courtyard of a small church, quiet and sun-dappled, where a fountain trickled lazily and swifts wheeled above. Philomena sat on the edge of the fountain, peeling off her gloves. Her hands were small and pale, but not soft. She had calluses on her fingers. "You play an instrument," he said. "Violin," she replied. "Badly?" "Well enough to be tolerated." They sat in silence. Then she asked, "What's your name?" "Xandro Bell." "You're not Portuguese." "My father was. My mother came from Virginia. She died when I was 5. "I'm sorry." He shrugged. "It was a long time ago." A bell rang from the cathedral tower, and she stood quickly. "They'll be looking. I can take you back." "I don't think you should." He wanted to reach for her hand but didn't. She looked at him once more before turning toward the alley. "Thank you, Xandro Bell." He didn't see her again for 2 weeks. Not until she returned to the docks, dressed this time in a plain linen cloak, alone. "You're late," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me." "I remember everything about you." She looked away, flustered. "I need a tutor." "In Portuguese." "My father says my accent is shameful." "You want me to teach you?" "You speak like the fisherman." "I want to sound like the people." He laughed. "You want to sound like someone who got sardines for a living?" "I want to sound like someone who belongs here." He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. Over the next month, they met in secret, in the courtyard behind the church, on the steps of a ruined Moorish tower, beneath the pine trees at the edge of the royal gardens. He taught her the local dialects, the fisherman's slang, the way her vowels could shift to sound like rain on cobblestones. She brought him books with English poetry, and once, a cherry tart she'd hidden in her coat. He dared one day to touch her hand when she passed him a paper. She didn't pull away. But it couldn't last. Lisbon was full of eyes. One afternoon, a man in grey stood too long beneath the shade of a fig tree. Another time, a note she'd tucked into his coat was missing when he returned home. Then came the duel. It wasn't meant to happen. Philomena's cousin, Lord Tommaso, had been watching her. He followed her to the Alfama quarter, saw her slip into the alley, saw Xandro there waiting. The next morning, he found Xandro at the docks. "You think she's a peasant girl, you idiot?" Tommaso hissed. "You think you're clever, teaching her how to curse like a fishwife?" Xandro tried to walk past, but Tommaso shoved him hard. "I'll see you at dawn," Tommaso spat. "By the old Moorish tower." Xandro didn't know how to fence. But he knew how to fight. At dawn, under the crumbling stones of the tower, they met. Tommaso brought a blade. Xandro brought a fishing knife. Philomena appeared just as the first cut grazed Xandro's side. "Stop," she shouted. Tommaso didn't. He lunged. Xandro ducked, rolled, grabbed the nobleman's wrist and twisted. The sword clattered to the ground. Philomena ran between them. "I love him," she said. Tommaso froze. "You love a fisherman? He taught me more about this country than you ever did." Tommaso looked at her, then at Xandro. "Then you've disgraced yourself." She stood tall. "Then I will live in disgrace." Tommaso left. Xandro dropped the knife. Philomena touched his bloodied sleeve, eyes wide. "You're hurt." "It's nothing." "It's something." He leaned in, forehead resting against hers. "You shouldn't have said it." "I meant it." And then she kissed him, right there under the tower, as the city woke to another day. The wound beneath Xandro's shirt had not yet crusted dry when a summons arrived 3 days later, not from the palace, but from the Marchioness of Santrum, Philomena's aunt on her mother's side. A gilded envelope with his name inked in a firm, slanted hand had found its way to the harbour master's desk, and from there into Xandro's calloused hands. He turned the letter over twice before opening it. Inside, the words were spare, formal, and without flourish. He was to present himself at the Marchioness's townhouse by sunset. No explanation. No signature, but the seal was unmistakable, a hawk in flight above a crown of laurel. He scrubbed the blood from beneath his fingernails, borrowed a clean shirt from his cousin who ran the net mender's stall, and walked across the city in shoes that pinched his heels raw. The Santrum townhouse stood behind iron gates threaded with jasmine, its facade pale as bone and window shutters painted the color of old moss. The butler who answered the door did not ask his name. He was expected. The Marchioness waited in a drawing-room lined with wool tapestries and dusky portraits of long-dead ancestors. Her hair was powdered silver though no strands looked false, and her gown was a muted green that caught the candlelight like the inside of a shell. She gestured to a chair but did not sit herself. "I knew your mother," she said. "She danced once at my wedding." Her accent was dreadful, but she had a voice people listened to. Xandro kept his posture straight despite the ache in his ribs. "She died when I was small. I remember." The Marchioness moved to a side table and poured a dark liquid into 2 cut crystal glasses. She handed one to him. "You've made quite a mess, Mr. Bell." "I didn't start it." "No, but you've forced a choice." He didn't drink. "What choice?" The Marchioness took a sip. "Philomena is to marry the Duke of Braganca's second son. Talks have been underway since Easter." Xandro's fingers tightened around the glass. "She didn't tell me." "She wasn't supposed to." He set the drink down. "I won't interfere." "You already have." "And yet." The Marchioness studied him. "She has changed. She speaks like a girl who's seen the truth of things. Not just books and court dinners, but hunger, and work, and the sound of boats leaving at dawn. She's seen it all her life," he said. "She just wasn't allowed to name it." The Marchioness's mouth quirked, not in amusement but in something like recognition. "You won't be offered a title, if that's what you're hoping." I'm not. She'll have to leave everything. Her position, her inheritance, the house in Sintra. You'll have nothing but your hands and her heart. That's more than most. The Marchioness turned to the window, where the lanterns in the square below were beginning to flicker on. I've seen love ruin clever women. But I've also seen it build kingdoms. I suppose the difference lies in the man. He waited. She finally turned. There's a gate behind the chapel garden. Third stair from the left is loose. Midnight. He stood. Thank you. No, Mr. Bell. Don't thank me. Just don't waste what she's risking. By the time he reached the chapel garden that night, the moon had risen high over the tiled rooftops. The loose stair gave way with a soft scrape, revealing a narrow passage that wound beneath the garden wall. He emerged in a thicket of orange trees, their blossoms ghost pale in the dark. She was already there. Her coat was unfastened at the neck, her hair undone from its usual twists, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She held a small bundle tied in linen. I didn't bring shoes with heels, she said. He reached for her hand. Good. They walked without speaking, through the old side streets that led toward the river. The air smelled of cooling stone and distant smoke. At the edge of the quay, his cousin's fishing boat waited, its sail furled, its deck scrubbed clean. I don't know how to be poor, she whispered. He cupped her face gently. I don't know how to be noble. We'll learn together. She leaned into his touch. My father will send people. Then we'll go where they won't find us. She looked toward the dark water, then back at him. I'm not afraid. I am, he said. But I'd be more afraid without you. They boarded the boat just before the tide began to turn. His cousin gave them a nod and stepped aside, taking the tiller only long enough to guide them past the harbor's mouth. From there, it would be Xandro's hands on the rope, Xandro's eyes on the stars. As the wind caught the sail and the boat tilted into motion, Philomena stood beside him, her fingers curled around the rail. She didn't look back at the city. She looked forward toward open sea, toward the uncertain line where sky met water. Xandro stood beside her, silent, steady, and sure. They didn't speak again until the city lights faded behind the curve of the coast. When we're ashore, she said softly, I want to learn to get mackerel. He looked over at her, a quiet smile tugging at his mouth. And I'll learn to read Latin. She reached for his hand, and this time, she didn't let go. The fishing village of Setúbal, tucked between the Arabida hills and the Atlantic's restless shoulder, welcomed them with neither curiosity nor suspicion. Strangers arrived often enough, fishermen from the Algarve chasing better shoals, or widows seeking quiet. Philomena and Xandro came ashore in wool coats that hid their finer cloth and salt-worn shoes that told no tales. Their boat was left moored beside others already forgotten by the tide. An old widow, Dona Graca, let them the top floor of her cottage in exchange for help mending nets and keeping her hens from wandering into the sea. She asked no questions beyond their names. The war had taken both her sons, and she had long since stopped expecting answers to anything. Philomena learned the weight of water buckets slung from her shoulders, the rhythm of sweeping a courtyard before dawn, the sting of smoke in her eyes when lighting a wood stove. She did not complain. She did not falter. The muscles along her arms began to lengthen. Her palms bore the fine beginnings of grit. Xandro took work on a sardine trawler owned by a man named Teofilo, who believed in hard labor and little talk. He paid in coin and bread, which suited them both. At night, Xandro would return with salt in his eyebrows and the smell of brine in his hair. He never came home empty-handed, sometimes with a string of red mullet, sometimes with stories of sea fire dancing beneath the hull. One evening, after the table had been cleared and the lamp turned low, Philomena rested her cheek against his shoulder, watching the flame flicker inside the glass chimney. I dreamt I was back in the palace, she murmured. But I couldn't remember which fork to use, and everyone kept staring. Did you care? I think I wanted to. But something in me was laughing. He traced the line of her wrist with his thumb. You always laugh when you're not supposed to. I used to be terrified of that. Now I think it's the truest part of me. In late spring, a traveling bookseller passed through the village, his cart stacked with almanacs, devotionals, and a few battered volumes of poetry. Philomena found a copy of Gil Vicente's plays and a French grammar tucked behind a sack of barley. She offered to trade her violin for them. The seller inspected the instrument, its varnish dulled, bowstrings frayed, but nodded solemnly. This has mourned and danced. It's worth more than paper. When she told Xandro that night, he looked at her in surprise. You loved that violin. I still do. But I love what it gave me more. They read the plays aloud in the evenings, her voice slipping easily into the old Portuguese cadences, his slower, rougher, but growing more confident. He began to write down the words he liked best in a small ledger: Saudade, Brando, Alvorada. Each one a piece of wind he couldn't hold but wanted to remember. One afternoon, as he stood on the edge of the jetty gutting mackerel, Teofilo approached with a folded scrap of paper. There's a gentleman asking for you. Says he's come from Lisbon by way of Evora. Xandro wiped his hands on his trousers, heart thudding. Did he say his name? Only that he was your kin. Philomena met him near the chapel, her hands stained with walnut dye from steeping cloth. If it's your cousin, we should hear him out. They found the man waiting near the olive press, a tall figure in a travel-worn coat and dusted boots. His face was unfamiliar, but his bearing was unmistakable. He moved like someone used to being obeyed. I'm looking for Xandro Bell, the man said. You found him. The man extended a hand. My name is Elias Hartwell. Philomena's breath caught, but she said nothing. I'm her uncle. Her mother's brother. Xandro remained still. You came alone. Elias nodded. She's no longer hunted. Your disappearance made certain of that. The scandal's been absorbed into other court whispers. The Duke's family moved on. Her father pretends she's abroad for health. Philomena stepped forward, her voice low but steady. Why are you here? Elias looked directly at her. Because I remember a girl who once hid frogs in my pockets. Who climbed trees in her petticoats and refused to wear gloves in summer. That girl wouldn't be frightened by titles or distance. I'm not frightened, she said. Good, Elias replied. Because I didn't come to take you back. I came to ask if you've built something worth staying for. She glanced at Xandro, then back at Elias. We have. Elias's shoulders eased. Then I'll leave word with the notary in Setúbal. I can't change court custom, but I can see your name isn't erased from the family scrolls. And I can ensure you inherit your mother's vineyard in Alentejo when the time comes. I don't need land, Philomena said. Elias smiled faintly. Perhaps not. But someday, you might want to plant roots. He turned to Xandro. You've done what no tutor, no minister, no suitor could. You taught her who she is. I only gave her room to be it. That's more than most men ever manage. Elias left with the same quiet grace he'd arrived. That evening, Philomena and Xandro stood on the bluff above the village, watching the last light bend across the water. Below, the tide inhaled and exhaled against the shore. She tucked her hand into his. When I was young, I thought love was a crown, she whispered. But it's not. It's a sail, catching wind where it can. He kissed her temple. Then let's keep chasing it. They stayed until the stars rose, not speaking, not needing to. By midsummer, the vineyard in Alentejo had passed quietly into Philomena's name. The deed arrived folded inside a satchel of weathered correspondence, hand-delivered by a courier on muleback. The land had been dormant since her grandfather's death, its vines untended, the soil overtaken by wild fennel and creeping grasses. But the stone house still stood above the valley, and the well at the edge of the olive grove ran clear. They arrived with only what they could carry: sacks of flour, a string of garlic, and the ledger where Xandro had begun recording new words. The village below the ridge was small, with no more than 60 souls, but the priest blessed their arrival with a quiet nod and 2 fingers to the sky. No one asked where they had come from. On their first morning, they cleared the front step of moss and swept the dust from the kitchen hearth. The air inside the house smelled of dry wood and old citrus peel. Beneath the loft window, a cracked ceramic bowl still held the shriveled remains of almonds. Philomena pressed her fingers into the cracked sill. "I never imagined I'd return here," she said. "How old were you, last time?" 7. "I got lost chasing a goat. My mother found me asleep between 2 olive trees." Xandro looked out over the slope. "It's good land. Needs work. So do we." They began in silence. He chopped back the brush with a borrowed scythe. She gathered stones from the path and rebuilt the low wall that once marked the vineyard's edge. Their hands blistered and bled. They wrapped them in linen soaked in rosemary oil and kept working. By the 6th week, the vines began to show green again. They marked each row with a slip of ribbon torn from the hem of one of Philomena's old skirts. In the evenings, they sat beneath the fig tree beside the well, their legs streaked with dust, eating bread dipped in oil and reading lines from the books she had carried. He preferred the ones about journeys. She liked the ones where nothing happened but the turning of seasons. One night, as crickets stirred in the dry grass, she laid her head on his thigh, her eyes fixed on the stars. "Do you miss the sea?" she asked. "Sometimes. But the wind's here too, just different." She reached for his hand, now rougher than it had been when they met. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we stayed in Lisbon?" "I try not to. That life doesn't belong to us anymore. Not even a little." He bent, lips brushing her hair. "Only the part that brought you to me." The following morning, a letter arrived from Elias, carried by a shepherd passing through from Evora. It bore news in a precise, slanted script: the royal court had shifted. A new minister had replaced the old guard, and with him came a quiet softening of long iron rules. The edict barring disinherited noblewomen from holding property within the kingdom had been repealed. There would be no summons. No trial. Only silence from the capital. Philomena traced the words with her thumbnail. "It feels strange," she said. "To be left alone." Strange, or good? She folded the letter. Both. Later that week, the village priest arrived with a basket of pears and a request. The chapel roof needed repair. Could Xandro help? Philomena offered to sew new linens for the altar. In return, the priest wrote their names into the parish register, not as nobility or fugitives, but as 2 people joined in faith and work. They wed beneath the almond trees in the back orchard with no guests but the priest, the midwife, and 3 curious goats. Philomena wore a dress stitched from unbleached linen, her hair braided with rosemary. Xandro's jacket was borrowed, his boots polished with beeswax. As the vows were spoken, a breeze stirred the leaves, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a lark sang once and fell silent. Afterward, they sat alone on the low stone wall, sharing the last of the pear wine. "You never said what your mother's vineyard looked like," Xandro said. Philomena smiled, eyes heavy with the warmth of dusk. "I think it looked like this. I just didn't know how to see it." He touched the corner of her mouth with his thumb. "You see everything now." "No," she said, leaning into him. "Just everything that matters." In the years that followed, the vineyard flourished. They planted new rows where the wild grass had been, built a wooden press from old barrels, and traded their first bottles at the autumn fair. Word of the wine spread as far as Beja, then Evora, then beyond. No one asked whose blood had once run noble in the vines, they only asked for more of the vintage with the paper label marked with 2 initials P and X. Philomena wrote to Elias once a season. He replied with news of the world beyond the hills of elections, of reforms, of letters from her younger cousin who now studied medicine. She read the letters aloud to Xandro by the fire, each time folding them carefully and placing them in a carved box beside their ledger of words. One spring, a child was born. A daughter, with eyes the color of olive leaves and her father's quiet mouth. They named her Alva, for the dawn wind that slipped through the vines each morning before sunrise. She grew up barefoot and sun-browned, learning the names of herbs in 3 languages, riding on her father's shoulders through the rows, and helping her mother bind the grapevines with twine before the summer heat took hold. And when, one evening, Philomena stood by the well watching her daughter chase butterflies through the tall grass, she turned toward the house where Xandro worked shaping a new barrel and called to him. He looked up. She said nothing, just lifted her hand, palm outward, fingers splayed. He raised his hand in return. The wind lifted the hem of her skirt. And she smiled, not because she was content, though she was, but because she had chosen this life, this man, this soil. The wind had not carried her away. It had brought her home.